Hi guys, Pete the Wargamer here, and welcome back to another bolt-action painting tutorial. In this video, I'll be tackling the new US Infantry from Warlord Games, and as always, I'll be using the Army Painter range of paints to do so. Before we start painting, we first of all need to apply a primer so that the later layers of paint adhere to the miniature's surface. It doesn't matter too much which colour you go for, but I've opted to use a light grey airbrush primer. The first paint that I'll be using is Combat Fatigues, but before I apply it to the miniature, we need to water it down slightly. So place some of the paint on your palette, dip a brush in some water and mix it into the paint to give it a slightly watery consistency. Remember that if you're using a wet palette like myself, then you don't need to mix in quite as much water, as a palette will assist in that. The first steps in painting your miniature is to apply base coats. We'll begin by painting our infantryman's jacket using our thinned Combat Fatigues. As with all of our subsequent base coats, I would recommend applying your first coat and allowing it to dry before applying a second coat over the top. This layering technique is why it's important to thin your paints, and will give an overall smoother finish without running the risk of accidentally obscuring details by applying the paint too thickly. Our next base coat will be applied to the trousers, and for this we'll be using Venom Wyrm. Remember to apply it in the same way as we did in the last step. In this step, we'll now be using the paint Hemp Rope to base coat all of the webbing, helmet straps, pouches and also the gaiters. The next areas to paint include the wooden stock of the weapons, as well as the brown leather boots, and for this I'll be using Dirt Spatter as our base coat. To paint the helmet, we want to use a darker colour green than the one that we used for the trousers, so I'll be painting it using Cultist Robe. In addition to the helmet, you can also paint the entrenching tool using this colour as well. Next up, we have all the metal areas on our miniature to paint, and we want to base coat these areas using Necromancer Cloak. The areas that I'll be tackling with this paint include the weapon itself, as well as any buckles or buttons that there may be. Now, Necromancer Cloak is perfect for representing that darkened gunmetal colour. The last base coat to apply to our miniature is to the bare skin areas, and for this we want to use a base coat of Kobold Skin. With our base coats completed, we now want to apply our washes, but before we do so, we need to again thin them down. This is because applying washes straight from the bottle can be much too strong. However, instead of using water, this time I'll be mixing in some of the Army Painter's Quickshade mixing medium in equal parts wash to medium. The medium works by reducing the amount of pigment in the ink without changing its consistency. I find that this results in a much smoother and more subtle result than mixing in water. However, if you don't have access to this medium, you could instead use distilled water. Now that we've covered how to thin down your washes, we now want to apply strong tone across all of the areas of the miniature except the skin and the metal areas. This wash will flow into all of those recesses and create the effect of shading, which will help to improve the miniature's level of detail. The brown colouring will also subtly dull down many of the colours, giving them a more dirtier and grittier appearance. Using the same techniques as before, you can now go over the skin using Flesh Wash. And for our final wash, you can now go over the areas that we painted using Necromancer Cloak, using Dark Tone. Using a slightly thin drake tooth, we now want to lightly drag the tip of a thin brush along the raised edges of the jacket. This is called a highlight because it creates a small line of lighter paint along the edges, which helps to make the raised folds stand out more, giving the jacket much more detail. Thinning down the paint mixture will make this task much easier, as the flow of paint should be much smoother than if you had used it straight from the bottle. Our second highlight will be to the trousers, and for this we want to use Combat Fatigues. All of those areas that we painted earlier using Hemp Rope can now be highlighted using Banshee Brown. I'll then be highlighting the edges of the metal areas using Spaceship Exterior. A thin brush is important here, as by applying only a thin line of light grey paint, we can give the effect of a slight reflection coming off the darkened metal surface. The final step in painting the skin is to highlight using Corpse Pale. Using this paint, you'll want to pick out the more prominent features of the face using a thin line. These areas include the nose, lips, chin and also the cheekbones. But don't forget to also paint the fingers and the hands as well. The final step in painting your US Infantryman is to highlight all of the wooden and leather areas using Fur Brown. And here we have the finished miniature. I finished off the model by creating a simple mud and grass base before also spraying the whole miniature with an anti-shine matte varnish to remove any glossy effect from the surface. You can find a full list of all the paints used in this tutorial in the description below, along with a link to the everlasting wet palette that I made use of in this video as well. And so that concludes this video on painting your US Infantry. If you enjoyed this video, please do let me know in the comments below, along with your suggestions for other bolt action or similar historical tutorials you'd like to see me tackle in the future. Also, make sure you subscribe to be kept up to date with all of my latest content, and if you're interested in supporting me in making these videos, you can do so by checking out my Patreon page, which you can find a link to in the description below. From there, you can donate to me from as little as $1 a month, which just really helps me in producing these videos. So the only thing left to say is thanks for watching, and goodbye.